Well, like everything else in American history, the coronavirus is not impacting everyone equally because Black and Brown people are more likely to be considered essential and required to go to work. They're dying at much higher rates. Our next guest, Heather McGhee, is an expert on race policy in America. Her recent TED Talk is Racism Has a Cost for Everyone. Very powerful. I'll ask her about that and how a racial justice lens will help us beat the coronavirus. Heather, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be with you all.
Can you talk about what you do, your policy work, and how
Yeah.
it's led you to focus on how racism is negatively impacting everyone, including the white people?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I've been working in public policy for almost 20 years. I started working at the think tank that I ran from 2014 to 2018 called Demos, which is
Love
a
Demos. A lot of good ideas coming out
thank
of
you.
there.
We're a think tank that helps power the progressive movement. Our focus is squarely on inequality in our democracy and our economy. And I started working there when I was 22 years old. And what really drove me was the economic question. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the 1980s and 90s when deindustrialization and the choice of corporations to shutter factories and to find cheaper labor, and the choice of politicians to cut back on government services and government jobs hit the Black community, first and hardest. Of course, we're now seeing that same formula roll across the rest of the country. But I
But the
really
white people are very mad about it when it
very
happens to
mad,
them.
very mad. um, but I was really driven by these economic questions. Why is the economy this way? Why, when the people around me, are so skilled at making a way out of no way and work so hard, is the public political narrative demonizing those same kinds of people, single mothers like my mother? And why is it that it's so hard for the average family to get ahead? And I went to work at Demos when I was 22, working on the economic program. The first issue that we worked on was the issue of debt. At the time, we were looking at credit card, the deregulated credit card industry that was just, super profitable and trapping people in debt, the subprime mortgage lending boom and payday loans, things like that, the rise of student debt. And it was
Mm.
clear to me that this was a question of corporate power. It was clear to me that it was a bipartisan support for deregulation and for ignoring the pain that working and middle class families were feeling. But it also became clear to me, and particularly in the story of the financial crisis, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, which was went online on Thursday.
Fabulous.
Um,
Watched it last night.
Thank
It's
you, thank you.
beautiful. Wonderful.
I talk about this in my TED Talk, is that I truly believe we would not have had a financial crisis if it weren't for racism. Because what happened was, I'll tell the story, and I think it has a real sad corollary in our current moment. And this is so often not the story that most people have in their heads about what happened in the financial crisis, which is really frustrating to me because I was, my colleagues and I were on the front lines trying to prevent the crisis. Because in the 2000s, the mortgage companies designed a brand new product that was not the simple, safe 30-year mortgages that had built the white middle class back when brown and Black people were explicitly denied the opportunity to have mortgages and to live in newly developed suburban communities. But these were new kinds of loans that had teaser rates and balloon payments and that could be marketed to someone. And it didn't matter if they had a good credit score. Basically, if a salesperson could tell you, here's your mortgage at 10%, um, you could sign. And it didn't matter if you actually qualified for a 6% mortgage. And it was targeted to Black and brown communities of existing homeowners. This weren't people who were stretching to get into homes that they couldn't afford. These were
That's the
existing
thing I didn't
homeowners.
realize when I watched your TED Talk. That
That's
was
right.
possibly the most egregious point. They just went door to door knocking, saying, "Hey, let me refinance your home for you that you've been doing a good job paying on, and
That's right.
you
That's
own."
right. You may be, a struggling middle class person like everybody else, right? You may have a medical debt or something you want to refinance. You may have a leaky roof. You may want, for some reason, to find a little more, cushion in your budget. So here's a lifeline for
Who
you,
doesn't want that?
right? Who doesn't want that? And here's it's going to have a 1 in 5 chance of making you lose your house, right? But of course, that's
They
not
didn't
something
tell you
that's
that part, right? They
exactly.
didn't. Yeah.
But once that formula was perfected, Then it spread out to the wider and wider mortgage market in the mid 2000s. But if anybody with the power to stop it had cared when it was only happening to Black and Brown homeowners, if they hadn't substituted their own stereotypes of, it's these are people who were never really, had mortgages before. Maybe they just, didn't really know what they were doing. Maybe they're not that good at money, which is the same logic that substantiated redlining, right? There's sort of something wrong with Black people and money. They're always going to be poor. They're always going to be kind of locked out of the mainstream financial market. And so all of these other stereotypical stories just made it easier to think this isn't something dangerous. This isn't the fault of Wall Street. This is the fault of, hapless brown and Black homeowners. If
I do have a question though.
Yeah.
Maybe how is it that so many people couldn't see don't you get the terms of the loan where it says it's going to balloon up and you'll never
Oh
get out of
no.
it? And like, how could they not?
Have you ever done a closing on a mortgage?
No,
Hmm.
that's someone
So
please explain. I'm not there yet. I'm a millennial.
so
Can't afford
first of
anything.
all, we don't have a lot of consumer protections. There should be a standard that says, the broker, the seller, the lender has to give you a mortgage that is suitable for your financial situation. And maybe there should be a law that says you have to get the best thing that you qualify for. But what happened was brokers, which is a new thing, brokers who were just basically salespeople, right? They took a lot of tricks from the, sort of used car salesman bag of tricks, could just not disclose it, right? You get a stack of paper that's 40 pages long that nobody reads the entirety of. You get walked through it, but there's nothing that said that person had to actually say it. It's not like at the top of the credit card statement, which we fought for, that box that says if you don't pay this much every month, you'll actually be paying, $50,000 on a $10,000 credit card bill, whatever, right? None of that is required. It is not required to disclose that the broker actually gets to pocket the difference between the rate that you qualify for and the rate that they can sell you, something called a yield spread premium, which is a broker kickback. That basically the more expensive they make the loan for you, the better it is for everybody else, right? Everybody takes a piece. It's just like good old fashioned American, salesmanship that would allow someone to, get over on someone. And when you realize how widespread it was in Black communities, but then across the entire mortgage market, you think, what, actually, it's probably not the fault of everyone.
Yeah.
It's probably the fault of abusive lenders who had every incentive to hide the truth of what was going to happen.
Oh, and when people saw the writing on the wall, when they saw what was happening, when the balloon payment hit, what were the reactions of people in communities of color? Was there a coming together? I'm sorry if I missed this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it varied.
When they realized it wasn't just them, one particular family.
I think there was
who
a
had gotten
lot of
into it.
organizing. Yeah, there was a lot of organizing. And that's how the issue, came to light to us, at Demos, because community groups, were seeing this as an issue that was, filling the church basements because people had all gotten that knock on the door, and, but debt is something that carries a lot of shame, right? That reaction that you had was something that they had. I should have known better. I personally should have, known better. I should have figured out that this was too good to be true. I should have. And so there's a lot of shame, and shame, as we all know, as organizers, is a really hard thing to have people move into a systemic analysis, right? Because they're all just thinking about what they individually could and should have done.
Sure.
And so, but there was a lot of organizing. Acorn, was an organization that was really organizing a lot of Black and brown families around these housing issues. And there was a lot of agitation for predatory lending reforms that would have stopped it. And in some counties and states, they did pass them. And then at the federal level, they often preempted them. The biggest national bank regulator took one action in 15 years on predatory lending, and it was to protect its banks from state and local predatory lending laws.
Are these still happening, these loans?
To some degree, now it's actually a reverse problem. I mean, there's, the mortgage market changed radically, obviously, both with the crash itself, when the money dried up. Investors, rich people stopped wanting to invest in these kinds of high cost loans after the crash. And there are more consumer protections than there is Elizabeth Warren's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a cop on the beat. Now we have, though, the reverse problem, which is that lenders are now very, very strenuous and stringent in their criteria. 20% down, 700 or above credit score, and so there is now a loss of home ownership that happened because of the financial crisis and the foreclosure crisis that followed, so that Black families actually have a homeownership rate that is back to what it was before the Fair Housing Act, which is a national tragedy,
Oh
and
my.
too few people talk about it. But the reason why I tell the financial crisis story as a story of racism, fueled by greed, that went unchecked and then spilled out to take down the entire global economy, is because in my career, what I've witnessed is that so much of the economic problems that we go to attack, that may be in some ways, sort of race neutral economic problems, like the minimum wage being stuck at 7.25 an hour. We don't think of that as a race problem. There's a disparity, right? Because there are more people of color who are in minimum wage jobs, but it's not like a racist policy. We don't think of it that way. But in fact, it is. When we look at the fact that unions have been attacked, if you look at so much of the weapon that has been used to drive down white popular opinion around supporting unions, it has been to racialize the idea of unions. The central story of my TED Talk and of the book that I have written, that is not out until after the election, but it's available for pre-order now. It's called The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. In my book, the central story is the story of towns across the country, not just in the American South, that had whites only public amenities that were generous and beautiful and well funded,
Mhm.
like public park systems,
The
schools,
pool
and
that you
pools.
discussed.
And
Yeah.
they drained their public swimming pools, closed down their parks departments, privatized their schools when integration happened. So that, of course, white families lost out on a public resource as well, but it was all driven by a desire not to share across lines of race. And I do think that's the sort of metaphor for this political moment, is that that has been our Achilles heel. It's been the Achilles heel of the left, to try to find some cross-racial solidarity. And it's been the Achilles heel of this country since our founding, is just the fundamental question: can we be a multiracial democracy? Can we have solidarity across race? And the current crisis around COVID-19 and healthcare is just an object lesson in that. We are only as safe as the most vulnerable among us. And our unwillingness to have universal healthcare, our unwillingness to have a universal system to deliver healthcare and to make decisions and move priorities around, our unwillingness to have any kind of system of a safety net that would prop up our economy immediately and automatically. Germany and France, their unemployment rate went up by 1.5% as they closed down their economy, because they were able to turnkey and support businesses to keep their people on payroll. We have one of those programs, rare bipartisan agreement, the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program, but it's reaching a small number of businesses. It's been skewed to big corporations, even though it's supposed to be for small businesses. And it's been a nightmare because we've routed it through the same big banks that have shut out real small businesses and minority owned businesses forever.
Heather, when it comes to the issue of hate, do you believe that uh, that people who really hate races other than their own, let's say white people who really hate Black people, just to make it specific, if they are aware that they are cutting off their nose to spite their face, I still think they're going to cut off that nose, because the hate problem is not going to be affected by the fact that their own children or their their own personal self is going to be affected. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there are hardcore white supremacists who have a have a visceral hatred for immigrants, for people of color, for Black people, and they are absolutely consciously willing to, they would say, sacrifice in order to keep this country, white, or in order to make sure that white people are still on top. And of course, we thought that was more of a fringe element. Obviously, the Trump administration has brought that element to the fore and has done a lot of enlarging of that consciousness in our society. That's still not the majority, though. The majority of white people don't hate people of color. I mean, even Donald Trump would say, I don't hate people of color. Look, I know this Black person. I know this Black person. I know these immigrants. I employ these immigrants.
I love the blacks, he
You
said,
know,
I think.
yeah, I love the Black. Um, so that's not about hate, but it is about a belief that some people are just better than others. And there could be some exceptions to that rule, right? There's the Oprahs, the Michael Jordans, they're great Black people. But in general, the idea that I think is much more prevalent and much more insidious is not that I hate people of color, it's that people of color just aren't as deserving, that who knows, maybe it's not biological, but it's cultural. People of color just, can't quite cut it. And so when something is happening that is bad to them, it's their fault. They should have known better. They made some choices that put them in this situation. That's actually far more prevalent as an opinion. And how that ends up showing up in public policy is that you end up having policies that you would never actually support if you believed in the intrinsic value and worth of every one of your fellow Americans, right? You wouldn't support children being in cages if
No.
you believed that every human being was just as worthy as you. It had the same ambitions and goals and grit. You wouldn't support a poverty minimum wage. You wouldn't support, allowing only rich people to be the beneficiaries of most economic policies. But we have a strong belief in a hierarchy of human value, right? Poor people don't need more money in their pockets, but rich people always need more money in their pockets, and that's better for everybody. Um, so that's actually more of the issue. Hate, it is what it is, but because it's not something that drives American policy, I'm not as focused on it. I'm more focused on that sort of soft but insidious and powerful degradation of human worth that just comes from thinking that some groups of people are just better than others.
Heather, we just spoke with Professor Richard Wolff about the potential, the disaster that's happening in our economy right now, but also the potential for, um, some reckoning on the economic level for, underprivileged groups. What do you see? Do you see this moment in time as an opportunity to make some corrections around racial injustice that are happening right before our eyes?
Absolutely. Everything is cracked open right now. The foundations of our economy and our society are absolutely shook. The fact that we have some bipartisan support for in Washington, not just among Americans, but in Washington for ideas like a guaranteed income, for paid leave, for we've seen some things like ICE detentions put on hold and prisoner releases. A lot of the things that progressives have been fighting for. As sort of shrinking of our carbon footprint and air pollution. There's
I'm
a way
excited
to
about that.
right, there's a way to read some of the possibilities when all of the machinery of capitalism is sort of ground to a pause. I will not say a halt, but a pause, as this is a moment to rethink everything, and to shift and find new alignment. Support for Medicare for all is at its highest level, right? Of course, that happens when 3 million people lose their health insurance in a week, right? So I think that for progressives, the requirement right now is to be innovative and smart about how to protest and how to put leverage on and put pressure on Congress when we can't roll up to the capitals. Um, and then it's to make sure that everybody has a voice at the ballot box in November, and to make sure that Wisconsin never happens again. The idea of Republicans forcing people to vote in a way that put their health at risk. And then to put pressure on making sure that the Democratic standard bearer recognizes that this is an FDR moment. It doesn't matter, kind of where Joe Biden's political alignment, was in recent different eras. This is a totally new era, and it's incumbent upon us to both support and to push. Um, and I actually think that we are going to see, we've already seen Joe Biden support debt cancellation. We've seen him move on some climate demands. This is our job, right? This is our job. There are no saviors, even the ones we like. There are no saviors. It's our job to take this moment and to remake America in a stronger way and to come out of this stronger.
Heather, we have questions coming in from the stream chat, one of which is, were you, Heather, satisfied with the way Bernie Sanders had engaged or has engaged African Americans?
Oh, very good question. So I think that I love Bernie Sanders. I've known him for a really long time. In the fights that we were having in the early 2000s to try to get someone to get tough on Wall Street, he was always there. He grew a lot between the 2016 race, where he just couldn't quite get out of the sort of white socialist framework that put class always to the exclusion of identity issues, and in fact, sort of doubled down on it when pressed. For him and his framework of seeing the world, it really is about class. I think he moved a lot, and you saw his support, particularly among younger people and Latinos, in this past cycle, show that he did a lot more organizing and listening. But I don't think that fundamentally he and the sort of class-based left of which I consider myself a former member in some ways, really contends with racialized politics, right? And by that I mean very simply, there is a lack of awareness about how much race is an effective weapon against social democratic policies. So it's all good and well that white Americans support big progressive ideas in theory. And then it takes just a little bit of race baiting and fear mongering, and we end up with things like the Affordable Care Act that has, Medicaid as an option, right, because of a states' rights ruling, basically, by the Supreme Court. And then we have it left to the states where, surprise, surprise, most of the former Confederacy refuses to expand Medicaid because Medicaid is seen as a racialized thing for undeserving poor people of color. So the unwillingness to contend with why we're not Denmark, right? Why we don't have a social democracy, and it's because of the original and ongoing sin of racism, is something that I think, for a lot of the Black people in my family who didn't support Bernie Sanders, it was just sort of like you're naive to not recognize that that it's going to be harder than you think if you don't go full frontal on an attack of racism itself and racist beliefs and racist tropes. Some of which you heard from his mouth as well. I mean, it's going to take a new generation of thinking to knit together a cross-racial working class coalition. I think it's happening all over the country. Things like the Fight for 15 are showing it, but I don't think the sort of old way of thinking of class as the defining feature of American society really is realistic about what a weapon racism is.
Do you think Joe Biden will be able to overcome some of the criticisms of him in terms of the prison industrial complex and his role in creating that? People are kind of asking the same question about Joe Biden as was just asked about Bernie Sanders.
Right.
How has Joe Biden, and what does he need to do to engage African Americans and people?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, Joe Biden has a record on race that is, it's unfortunate.
Spotty at best, shall we say?
Spotty at best.
always thought Joe
And
Biden was the dog whistle of the Obama presidency.
that's right.
Kind of, yeah, just
Yeah,
saying,
I mean,
I'm black, but you guys are still in charge over here. You know,
he chose Joe Biden in many ways because Joe Biden was an avatar of a white, male working class, kind of pro-union but skeptical on things like integration and affirmative action and tough on crime. And so that was an important strategic move for the first black presidential nominee to say, I got a white guy best friend too, right? He's cool with me, so you guys can be cool with me. I do think it changed him, right? I think both being in that White House for 8 years and also seeing the depth of the racism changed Joe Biden. But I also think that fundamentally, and I do believe that the level of Black support for Joe Biden reflected the awareness that Joe Biden is a lot closer to the median white voter than Bernie Sanders is, and um, Donald Trump remaining in office is not it's not an option, right? This is about a united front against fascism. And this current moment of people in our community losing their lives because of his incompetence and selfishness and greed, it's not an option. It doesn't matter what we would love to have. It's about what the voting white majority of America will accept. And that's the kind of real politics that I think the left, of which I consider myself a proud member, needs more of, to not get confused that just because we're loud on Twitter, we have more electoral strength than we think we do, and that it's hard to build that kind of power, and you have to actually do it with a real consciousness of the existence of racism, and actually this is why, for me, my journey has taken me towards wanting to confront racism head on and to try to make a bigger tent of conspirators around taking on racism as the unifying electoral force that has stopped progressive policies. Because doing any of this work to try to change our economy without calling out racism and starting to create a movement of people who see their own self-interest in combating racism and overcoming it, and to rejecting racist beliefs and to being anti-racist, and recognize that, when I actually sort of blame people for their own misfortune, that's actually like a racist belief that I have. That's something that is, something that I've inherited from a society that always wants to do that, and that, is really actually not willing to look at the systemic. When I think it's okay for people to live, to be, one step away from homelessness. And that I think that the government has no responsibility to make sure that if corporations are not paying people enough to meet their basic needs, then we all have to do that. Those are actually beliefs that come from a tolerance for pain and suffering of my fellow man, that suggests that I actually don't have empathy across lines of race, and I don't um, really put myself in the shoes of people who are suffering. And part of the reason for that is that America has taught me not to. And part of the way that it's taught me not to is to believe that someone is of a different race, which is itself an illusion, a biological illusion. Um,
My thought about Bernie Sanders wanting to focus on class versus race is that I thought that he, not that I support that, but I thought that he wanted people to come together and identify with each other if they saw each other as, across racial lines, oppressed by the same
yep.
system of oppression.
I think that is the most generous reading of it, that he was aware of racism. I mean, of course, he's aware of racism, but that it was a deeply race conscious effort to get people to identify with class. But you can't skip over identity to get to class, right? That is the thing that we have learned time and time again, is that if you just do a colorblind economic populist message, we actually tested this at Demos. If you just do a colorblind economic populist message, it'll get a lot of head nods from white folks, corporate greed, inequality, corruption, etc. But we live in a highly racialized world. So picture someone going to a Bernie Sanders rally, then getting back in their car and turning on, a Trump press conference or a Hannity or a Limbaugh, right? And then they hear a total counter narrative that actually is much more emotionally resonant, which is about who we are as human beings, right? Which has a villain that's a lot more tangible and less complicated, because corporations, we have complicated feelings about, because we aspire to that. Nobody aspires to being an undocumented immigrant or a Black person in the inner city, right? So there's not that complicated feeling, and so it's easier I think consciousness is always vulnerable to that race baiting. And so if you don't call out the race baiting, if you don't identify it, if you don't give people a shield and a way to understand what they're hearing from the White House on a near daily basis, because you want to do a colorblind thing and have people just relate to class, you're not arming white people with the tools they need to navigate a highly racialized political discourse. And so that's why we really recommended to Elizabeth Warren, to the Bernie Sanders campaign, that you've got to call out the dog whistling just as you're talking about corporate greed, because corporate power has used racism in order to grow their own power. And so we have to make an army of race conscious white people who are focused on class, but recognize that they're not going to get goals without recognizing the racism as a weapon.
We're speaking with Heather McGhee, political commentator, political strategist. Um, Her new TED Talk is out. Go definitely watch it. We have so many people thanking you. And I do want to read from Georgie Porgy for Heather. Thank you so much. I was trying to explain that to white leftists, and it felt like screaming into the void, and it drove me almost insane. So and people saying another great conversation. We had other questions for you. Can you answer this final one? Because your
Sure.
thoughts are just so helpful, but I don't want to keep you over the time we've asked you to be here. Do you think that it's possible to attain an equitable society within capitalism? And that's from Lecton.
So I think we need to define what we mean by capitalism. I am, the most thrilled of anyone that we are now really talking about systems in that way. 10, 15 years ago, an average conversation online would not have talked about, the capitalist system. But what do we really mean? And I think there it gets a little loose, right? Some talking, when they mention capitalism, they are talking about the idea of unregulated and regulated in their interest corporate power, right? They're talking about a system where corporations really are uber citizens and get to write the rules. And those same people, and I would actually count Bernie Sanders as one of these people, would be actually pretty happy to go back to the kind of managed capitalism that we had in the 1950s, or the social democracies of the current European West, where there are still corporations with investors that are traded on the public market, right? Bernie Sanders, other than healthcare, wasn't actually advocating for nationalizing industries, right? He was advocating for a stronger social safety net and role of government, and stronger unions to be a countervailing force.
Well, you wouldn't have known that by watching Fox. Oh.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think we need to get more precise about exactly we want to what part of capitalism we don't want, and what our vision is for a society with business still existing, but with a lot more social democratic rules and social democratic programs. I think that's actually what Bernie Sanders, if you look deeply at his policy agenda, which I did, it's not actually about undoing capitalism. It's about managing capitalism and having the kind of social democratic role for government that every other industrialized wealthy nation has. But they still have shareholders, they still have corporations. So do I think that we can have a much more fair, equitable society where corporations are in their place as third level actors after governments, unions, and independent community groups and nonprofit institutions. Yes. But I don't think that the kind of capitalism that we have in America, that's a racialized capitalism, that is a predatory capitalism, that is a dehumanized capitalism, is compatible with an equitable society. But do I think that there should be no private business in any sector of the economy? No, I don't think that's necessary. But I haven't heard, any of the standard bearers of the left really saying that. There are certain industries that need to be in the public interest. Healthcare is one of them. I would say that energy generation is another one. So yeah, anyway.
We've been speaking with Heather McGhee, political commentator, political strategist, currently a distinguished senior fellow and former president of Demos, the nonprofit progressive U.S. think tank. Her opinions, writing, research have appeared, everywhere good, like the New York Times, The Nation, and on the Hill. McGhee is writing a book about the personal and economic societal costs of racism to everyone in America, including white people. Her book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, will be published. When it will, is it?
It's available for pre-order now, wherever
Pre-order
books are
now.
sold, and it will be out after the election.
Oh, that's too bad.
I know. It's complicated. The publishing industry is struggling right now in the Trump economy, for sure. So.
You can follow Heather at McGhee, McGhee, on Twitter. Heather, I hope you'll join us again. I really appreciated this conversation.
Great to be with you, Julianna.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the work that you do, Demos. We rely on Demos to keep our minds right here in the progressive sphere. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.